Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into the world of Machado de Assis today.
Oh, Machado de Assis. He's brilliant, a truly fascinating figure in Brazilian literature.
Right, and considered one of the most important, I hear.
Yeah, definitely up there. He's really celebrated.
So what are we focusing on this deep dive?
Well, we're going to try to understand what makes his style so unique.
Cool. I'm all for that.
And a good way to do that, we'll look closely at one of his short stories, O Espelho.
O espelho.
Yeah, The Mirror. It's a good one. Really gets at some of his key themes and that signature style.
Okay, before we jump into the mirror, though, can you give us a little background on Machado de Assis himself?
Absolutely. So he was a 19th century Brazilian author. But what's interesting is he didn't just become a writer out of nowhere. I mean, he didn't come from like a super privileged background or anything. Really? No, quite the opposite. Humble beginnings, you could say.
Wow.
Worked all sorts of jobs, even as a typesetter early on. Imagine that.
Wow. So how'd he end up as this literary giant then?
Well, he was clearly talented and driven, and eventually his writing got him noticed.
I guess so.
He even became the first president of the Brazilian Academy of Letters.
Wow, that's a big deal.
Oh, yeah, huge honor. But throughout all of that, even with all the success and recognition, he never lost his sharp wit. Used it to explore these really complex ideas.
Like what?
Social norms,
Hmm.
poking fun at those, and then also really diving deep into the human psyche, psychology, all that good stuff.
Interesting. So even after he became part of the establishment, he wasn't afraid to critique it.
Not at all. He had this way of using humor and wit to point out contradictions, to challenge things.
That's cool. So how does the mirror fit into all of this? How does it showcase his style and the themes he was interested in?
Okay, so in the mirror, we've got this retired military officer. His name's Jacobina.
All right, Jacobina, retired military. Go on.
And he's living this pretty isolated life out on a remote
A
farm.
remote farm. Okay, what else?
And this is where it gets a little strange. He gets super fixated on this old uniform of his, like obsessed.
Okay, a retired officer, a remote farm, an obsession with a uniform. This already has the makings of a good psychological thriller.
Right, it really does. And then it gets even weirder. When Jacobina puts on the uniform, he starts to actually believe he's a completely different person.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's like the uniform triggers this alternate version of himself, leads him to question, like, his whole identity.
That's fascinating. Makes you think about, how much of who we are is tied to how we present ourselves, our clothes, our roles, all that.
Exactly. And that's precisely what Machado de Assis is exploring here, how these external factors can shape our self-perception.
And you said this story really exemplifies his style.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. He was a master of this style of writing. Psychological realism, it's called.
Psychological realism, what's that exactly?
It's all about getting inside the characters' heads, their thoughts, motivations, all the inner workings. He doesn't just tell you what's happening, he delves into the why.
I see. So it's like we're experiencing the story through the character's own thoughts and feelings.
Precisely. And Machado de Assis was so good at this. He could make you understand even the most flawed, complex characters. And he often did it with this touch of irony, dry wit.
Can you give us an example of that? Like, how does that dry wit show up in the mirror?
Oh, sure. There's this one passage where Jacobina, he's reflecting on his experience with the uniform, and he says, to be and not to be. That is the question.
Hold on, is that...
Straight from Hamlet, but placed in this completely absurd situation. Like, it highlights his struggle with these dual identities.
So he's using humor to actually point out these complex philosophical questions.
Exactly. He's got this way of poking fun at the seriousness of it all while still exploring these really deep themes. Human nature, identity, perception.
Pretty clever.
Oh, he was a master of it. And The Mirror, it's not just about this one guy and his uniform. It's also got this layer of social commentary, reflecting the expectations and pressures of, 19th century Brazil.
Like what kinds of pressures?
Well, back then, appearances mattered a lot. Your social role, how you presented yourself, that really influenced how people saw you. And how you saw yourself, too.
Kind of reminds me of social media today. We're always putting out this curated version of ourselves.
Yeah.
Trying to fit in.
Exactly. That pressure to conform, it's still there.
So even though he was writing over a century ago, Machado de Assis' observations about human nature and society feel really relevant today.
That's the thing about great literature. It speaks to these timeless truths. Human nature doesn't really change that much.
True enough. So we've got this story that's exploring identity, perception, societal pressures, all with this layer of irony and psychological insight. Anything else about the mirror that we should know? Anything that really highlights what makes Machado de Assis so unique? One more thing, actually. Something he was known for. Machado de Assis loved to leave things a bit ambiguous. He wouldn't always give you clear-cut answers or resolutions in his stories.
So it's up to the reader to interpret things, to fill in the gaps. Exactly. He wanted you to think, to engage with the story on a deeper level.
That's interesting. Not just telling you what to think, but making you work for it a little.
Yeah, it makes his work so much more compelling. It stays with you, makes you wonder.
So in the mirror, what are we left wondering? What are those big questions?
Well, did Jacobina really experience a shift in identity, or was it all in his head? How much of who we are is really shaped by external forces, by what other people think? Those are the kinds of questions Machado de Assis makes you ask.
That's heavy stuff. It seems like he wasn't afraid to tackle those big existential questions.
Not at all. He loved to delve into the complexities of human experience, to make us confront those uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the world around us.
So we've unpacked the mirror, gotten a taste of his style, psychological realism, dry wit, deliberate ambiguity, social commentary, all woven into this seemingly simple story. Amazing, but it's just one short story, right? How do these elements show up in his other works?
Well, that's what we're going to explore next. We'll dive into some of his other notable stories and novels, see what other fascinating insights we can uncover.
All right, so let's move on to something a bit longer now. One of Machado de Assis' most famous novels, actually, Dom Casmurro. It's a real journey.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that one. It's a love story, right?
It is, in a way, but it's also so much more than that. It deals with love, yeah, but also jealousy and this whole idea of, like, unreliable memory.
Unreliable memory. Okay. Before we get into the story itself, can you break down that idea a bit? What does it mean to have an unreliable narrator?
Sure. So, in literature, an unreliable narrator is basically a character who's telling the story, but you can't totally trust what they're saying.
Oh, interesting. So, like, they might be biased or something.
Exactly. They could be biased, they might be trying to mislead you on purpose, or maybe they just have a really flawed memory.
Ah, I see. Like they think they're telling the truth, but it's actually twisted somehow. Precisely. And that's what makes it so interesting. You have to read between the lines, consider other perspectives.
Gotcha. So, how does this all play out in Dom Casmurro?
Well, the story is told from the point of view of this guy named Bentinho. He's looking back on his life, particularly his passionate love affair with Capitu, the woman he loved, but ultimately suspected of cheating on him.
Oh, so we're seeing everything through Bentigno's eyes, but we can't be sure if he's being totally honest with us.
Exactly. And Machado de Assis, he plays with this ambiguity so well, he never actually reveals whether Capitu was truly unfaithful or if Bentinho is just letting his jealousy and maybe a faulty memory cloud his judgment.
So he's really leaving it up to us, the readers,
Yeah.
to decide what we believe.
Yep. And it makes you question everything, not just the characters, but also, like, how much we can ever really know for sure about other people, even ourselves sometimes.
That's deep. It connects back to that theme of perception we talked about in the mirror,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. But this time, he's exploring it through the lens of memory and through this potentially biased narrator. Makes you wonder how much our past experiences and our own baggage can distort our view of reality.
It makes Dom Casmurro sound like more than just a love story. It's almost like a psychological study.
It is a very clever one, too. And it brings up all these questions about how we interpret the past, how we construct our own narratives, and how easily those narratives can be influenced by our emotions.
So again, Machado de Assis isn't afraid to ask these tough questions.
Yeah.
And he's not giving us any easy answers.
Nope. He wants us to wrestle with them, to figure things out for ourselves. And this deliberate ambiguity, it's not limited to his exploration of romantic relationships either. In The Alienist, for instance, he tackles the whole idea of social control and sanity, but in a way that's both humorous and kind of creepy.
The Alienist? That sounds intriguing. What's that one about?
So picture this. There's this doctor, Dr. Simone Bacamarte, and he's totally convinced that he's cracked the code of mental illness. He opens up this asylum, the greenhouse or Casa Verde, and basically starts locking up anyone who he considers a little too different, too far from what he sees as normal.
Oh, wow. I'm already sensing some social commentary here. Like, who gets to define what's normal, right?
Got it. It's like if you were too generous or maybe a little too critical, you could end up in the Casa Verde.
That's wild.
Right. And that's the point. Machado de Assis is using this over-the-top scenario, this satire, to show how dangerous it can be when someone in a position of power starts labeling anyone who doesn't fit their narrow view as, like, mentally ill or deviant?
It sounds almost absurd, but I guess it's not that far off from how things work sometimes. We still see people trying to categorize and label others based on their beliefs or behaviors.
Exactly. And this theme of social control, the fear of being ostracized for not fitting in, it's something that resonates across time and cultures. Which is why, even though Machado de Assis was writing about 19th century Brazil, his work feels incredibly relevant today.
So to recap, we've got Dom Casmurro exploring the intricacies of love, memory, and perception through this unreliable narrator. And then the alienist tackles social control and the whole idea of sanity, using satire to expose the absurdity of rigid thinking.
Exactly. And through it all, Machado de Assis, he's really getting at something fundamental about human nature. The way we see ourselves, the way we perceive the world, and how easily those perceptions can be manipulated.
It's like he's peeling back the layers, forcing us to look at those uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the societies we create.
He is, and he does it all with this incredible blend of wit, intelligence, and a deep understanding of human psychology.
He's making us think, but he's also entertaining us along the way. That's a pretty impressive feat.
It is, and that's why I think he continues to be studied and celebrated today. He's got this unique ability to make us laugh and question everything at the same time.
All right, so we've talked about the mirror, Dom Casmurro, and the alienist, each giving us a different glimpse into Machado de Assis's genius. But let's zoom out a little. What was going on in 19th century Brazil that might have influenced his writing?
Oh, that's a great question. To really understand Machado de Assis, you have to understand the world he lived in. It was a time of immense change, and that definitely shaped his work.
So we've been really digging into Machado de Assis's style, right? And we've touched on some of his best-known works.
Mm.
But I keep thinking about the context. Like, what was life actually like back then in 19th century Brazil? What kind of world was he living in?
Yeah, that's important. Brazil in the 19th century, it was a nation in transition. Lots of changes happened.
In what way?
Well, for one thing, slavery was still a huge issue. It cast a long shadow over everything.
Right, slavery. Wow. It's hard to even grasp the impact of that.
Yeah.
How did that affect Machado de Assis, do you think?
It definitely shaped his worldview. I mean, he was a mixed race man himself,
Yeah.
right? And his grandparents were slaves.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah. So he was acutely aware of the inequalities and the injustices that were all around him.
Makes sense. Even if he wasn't writing directly about slavery all the time, those experiences must have influenced his work on some level.
Oh, absolutely. You can see those themes of race and class, social mobility. They're often present in his writing, even if they're not always front and center.
It's like a hidden layer, adding depth and complexity to the stories.
Exactly. And it's one of the reasons why his work still resonates today, because these issues, sadly, they haven't gone away. We're still grappling with them in different forms.
That's true. So he was reflecting the social realities of his time, but was he also pushing the boundaries of literature itself?
Definitely. He was a real innovator. You see, the popular style at the time was Romanticism, but Machado de Assis, he wasn't satisfied with that.
What did you do differently?
He moved towards realism. He wanted to portray life as it was, with all the flaws and contradictions. He was interested in the psychology of his characters, their inner lives, the stuff that Romanticism often glossed over.
Right. So he focused on those messy, complex characters we talked about earlier.
Yep. He gave us these flawed, relatable figures.
Yeah.
He showed us their motivations, their doubts, their hypocrisies. He wasn't afraid to go there.
I can see how that would have been a departure from the norm. It's like he was holding up a mirror, not just to society, but to the individual, showing us the truth beneath the surface, no matter how uncomfortable it might be.
Exactly. And his writing was so skillful, too. His mastery of language, the way he could weave in wit and irony even when dealing with serious subjects, it made his work both entertaining and thought-provoking. People wanted to read it.
This has been such a fascinating exploration of Machado de Assis, his work, and the world that influenced him. We've talked about so much: the psychological realism, the dry wit, the social commentary, the ambiguity, his use of unreliable narrators. It's a lot to take in. But if there's one key takeaway you want our listeners to remember, what would it be?
I think it's this. Machado de Assis was more than just a storyteller. He was a keen observer of human nature, a critic of society, and a true literary pioneer. His work has this timeless quality that continues to resonate with readers across generations.
He's definitely a writer worth exploring further. There's always something new to discover in his stories.
Absolutely. And I'd encourage everyone listening to give his work a try, whether it's The Mirror, Dom Casmurro, The Alienist, or any of his other incredible pieces. You won't be disappointed.
Well said. So to all our listeners out there, if you haven't already, pick up a book by Machado de Assis. You're in for a real treat. It's a journey into the depths of human experience, and it's one that will stay with you long after you finish reading.
Happy reading.